You really thought you belonged at this table? The laughter came first. Sharp, loud, effortless. It spread across the VIP section like a ripple across still water, drawing curious glances from donors, executives, and socialites gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Regent Ballroom in Midtown Manhattan. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala was supposed to be a celebration of business, influence, and philanthropy. Instead, at exactly 8:14 p.m., it became the beginning of a disaster no one in the room could yet see. Naomi Brooks stood motionless beside a white linen-covered table as a dark red stain slowly spread across the front of her ivory evening dress. Cabernet Sauvignon dripped from the fabric and landed softly on the polished marble floor. The room seemed to hold its breath for half a second. Then Ethan Whitmore smiled. 23 years old, privileged, and fully aware that most people in the room treated his last name like royalty, he casually lowered the empty wine glass in his hand. "Guess the staff should have seated you somewhere else," he said. More laughter followed. His friends nearly doubled over. One of them raised a phone, already amused by what he assumed would become the night's funniest story. Naomi looked down briefly at the stain before lifting her eyes back to Ethan. Her face remained calm. No anger, no embarrassment, no visible reaction at all. Somehow, that seemed to irritate him more. Across the table, Ethan's mother, Victoria Whitmore, exchanged a knowing smile with her husband. Richard Whitmore adjusted his tuxedo cufflinks and chuckled. "These events attract all kinds of people nowadays," Victoria said softly, though not softly enough. Several nearby guests heard every word. Some looked uncomfortable. Others pretended not to notice. That was easier. It usually was. Naomi stood alone. No entourage. No security. No designer logos announcing her status. Her jewelry was understated. Her makeup elegant but simple. To most people in the room, she looked like someone who had wandered too close to the VIP section by accident. Ethan glanced at the wine stain again and shrugged. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm sure somebody can help clean that up." The people around him laughed once more. Naomi simply reached for a cloth napkin and dabbed the edge of her dress. Her movements were slow and deliberate. Controlled. The kind of control that comes from experience. The kind earned after years of hearing assumptions disguised as jokes. Near the back of the ballroom, a young event coordinator named Claire Mitchell froze as she watched the exchange unfold. Her eyes widened. She recognized Naomi immediately. Unlike everyone else in that circle, Claire knew exactly who was standing there. She took a step forward, ready to intervene, but stopped when Naomi briefly met her gaze. A tiny shake of the head. Not yet. Claire remained silent. Meanwhile, Ethan leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the attention. The orchestra continued playing. Waiters carried silver trays through the crowd. Conversations resumed. The gala moved forward as if nothing important had happened. But hidden beneath the polished surface of the evening was a fact that would have stunned every person in that room. Tonight was not just a charity gala. It was the final night before a $650 million partnership would be approved or rejected. And the one person with the power to decide its future was standing quietly in a wine-stained dress while the Whitmore family laughed at her. The stain on Naomi Brooks's dress was already beginning to dry, but nobody at the Whitmore table seemed interested in moving on. Ethan remained the center of attention, basking in the approval of his friends and the amused smiles of his parents. To him, the moment was over. Another joke, another story to tell, another reminder that the room belonged to people like him. What he could not see was that the room had quietly begun dividing itself into two groups. Those who laughed with him, and those who were starting to watch Naomi. The orchestra shifted into a softer arrangement as servers moved between tables carrying crystal glasses and plated appetizers. Beyond the ballroom windows, the Manhattan skyline glowed against the night sky. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked controlled. Yet beneath the polished surface, one decision had the potential to change the future of multiple companies before midnight. Naomi stepped away from the table and moved toward a quieter section of the ballroom near a marble column. She carried herself with the same calm confidence she had displayed from the moment she arrived. No hurried movements. No visible frustration. She carefully folded the stained napkin and placed it on a nearby tray. Then she checked the time on her phone. 8:17. 3 minutes had passed since Ethan poured the wine. Across the room, Claire Mitchell still looked anxious. She approached cautiously. "Ms. Brooks," she said quietly, "I can have someone bring you another dress immediately." Naomi smiled faintly. "Thank you, Claire. That will not be necessary." Claire lowered her voice further. "They have no idea who you are." Naomi glanced toward the Whitmore family. Richard Whitmore was laughing with investors. Victoria was greeting donors. Ethan was retelling the story to another group of young guests who seemed entertained by every word. "No," Naomi said. "They do not." Claire hesitated. "Should I inform the board representatives that you are here?" Naomi considered the question for a moment. "Not yet." Her answer was calm, certain, deliberate. Claire nodded and stepped back. Naomi returned her attention to the ballroom. Most people knew Whitmore Holdings as one of the most influential real estate development firms on the East Coast. For 6 months, executives, attorneys, analysts, and consultants had been working toward tonight's agreement. A $650 million expansion project that could transform the company's future. What very few people knew was that the final approval authority belonged to Horizon Infrastructure. More specifically, it belonged to Naomi Brooks. She had spent years building Horizon from a regional construction company into one of the most respected infrastructure firms in the country. Bridges, transit systems, commercial developments, entire neighborhoods. Her signature carried weight in boardrooms from New York to Los Angeles. Yet standing in the ballroom tonight, she looked exactly the same as she always preferred to look. Professional, comfortable, unpretentious. The absence of visible status symbols often revealed more about other people than it did about her. Near the stage, several executives had already gathered around a large digital display showing promotional materials for the upcoming partnership announcement. The presentation was scheduled for later that evening. Reporters were arriving. Investors were arriving. Industry leaders were arriving. And somewhere in the growing crowd, whispers had already started. A few guests recognized Naomi. A few more thought they recognized her. Each passing minute increased the risk that someone would say her name aloud. Still, Naomi remained silent. Because she had learned something years ago. People reveal their true character long before they know they are being evaluated. And tonight, the Whitmore family was revealing far more than they realized. By 8:23, the Whitmore family had completely moved on from the incident. At least they thought they had. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the ballroom, speaking confidently with investors, while a small circle of executives listened to every word. He spoke about expansion, opportunity, and vision. He spoke like a man already celebrating a victory that had not yet happened. Victoria Whitmore moved effortlessly between guests, greeting donors and board members with polished charm. Every smile looked practiced. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. Together, they projected the image of a family accustomed to getting exactly what it wanted. Across the room, Ethan continued enjoying the attention. The story had somehow grown larger with each retelling. What began as spilled wine was now being described as a harmless joke, then a misunderstanding, then an overreaction by someone who supposedly could not take a little humor. His friends laughed on cue every time. Nobody challenged him. Nobody in his circle, at least. Naomi remained near the marble column, quietly observing. She had attended enough corporate events to recognize the performance unfolding in front of her. Wealth often revealed itself through confidence. Entitlement revealed itself through assumptions. Tonight, the Whitmores were displaying both. A waiter approached Naomi with a fresh glass of sparkling water. She thanked him warmly. The young man seemed nervous. He glanced toward Ethan's table before lowering his voice. "I am sorry about what happened earlier, ma'am." Naomi accepted the glass with a small smile. "Thank you." The waiter nodded and walked away. It was a brief interaction. Yet unlike the Whitmores, he had recognized something simple. Basic respect required no title, no net worth, no invitation list. Meanwhile, the crowd inside the ballroom continued to grow. Additional investors arrived. Reporters checked equipment near the stage. Several executives from Horizon Infrastructure entered through the main doors and immediately scanned the room. One of them appeared ready to approach Naomi before another quietly stopped him. A subtle gesture. A silent warning. Not yet. Near the display screens, Richard Whitmore was explaining future projections to a group of potential partners. "This partnership changes everything," he said proudly. "Once the final approval comes through tonight, we move forward immediately." One investor nodded. "Have you met with Horizon's chief executive yet?" Richard smiled confidently. Not personally, but our teams have been communicating for months. Everything is essentially finalized. Essentially, the word hung in the air like an invisible crack in glass. Across the ballroom, Naomi heard every syllable. Her expression never changed. Victoria soon joined the conversation. Whoever signs off on this deal is making the easiest decision of their career, she said. Several guests laughed politely. Ethan appeared moments later, carrying another drink. If they have any sense at all, he added. More laughter followed. Yet this time, not everyone joined in. The atmosphere was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. More people had begun noticing Naomi. More people had begun recognizing faces from Horizon infrastructure quietly gathering around the room. Questions were forming. Connections were being made. Ethan remained oblivious. Richard remained confident. Victoria remained certain. They believed they were hosting the future. They believed they were impressing the people who mattered. What none of them realized was that the most important evaluation of the evening had already begun. And with every careless comment, every arrogant assumption, and every laugh at someone they considered beneath them, the Whitmore family was writing its own report card while the one person who mattered most stood silently nearby and watched. By 8:29, the energy inside the Grand Regent Ballroom had changed in a way that could not be measured but could be felt. Conversations still filled the room. Glasses still clinked. The orchestra still played beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet an invisible current had begun moving through the crowd. More guests were looking toward Naomi Brooks. More guests were whispering. More guests were asking the same question. Where had they seen her before? Near the stage, a senior investment analyst named Daniel Harper narrowed his eyes as he studied Naomi from across the ballroom. He had attended enough infrastructure conferences to recognize faces that mattered. Something about her seemed familiar. He glanced toward a colleague. Am I imagining things? He asked quietly. Or is that Naomi Brooks? His colleague followed his gaze. The color immediately drained from his face. No, he said. That is Naomi Brooks. The realization spread between them like a spark. Neither man spoke another word. Across the room, Claire Mitchell noticed the exchange. She was not the only one. A few Horizon representatives standing near the presentation screens had also seen it happen. The number of people who recognized Naomi was growing. The number of people who understood the significance of her presence was growing even faster. Yet the Whitmore family remained completely unaware. Ethan had moved to another group of young guests and was still enjoying the attention. You should have seen her face, he said with a laugh. She looked completely shocked. A few people chuckled politely. Others did not. One woman quietly excused herself and walked away. Another man looked toward Naomi with visible discomfort. The story was no longer landing the way Ethan expected. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore continued discussing projections with investors. His confidence remained absolute. Everything is aligned, he said. Once tonight's announcement is complete, we move into the next phase immediately. One investor nodded but seemed distracted. His attention kept drifting toward Naomi. Richard noticed. Something wrong, he asked. No, the investor replied carefully. Just wondering whether Horizon's leadership is attending tonight. Richard smiled. I have been assured they are fully supportive. Assured. The word sounded strong. The certainty behind it was not. Victoria Whitmore soon joined the conversation, carrying a glass of champagne. This partnership is practically done, she said. At this point, it would take a miracle for anything to change. Several people exchanged glances. Nobody challenged her directly. Not yet. Near the marble column, Naomi remained composed. She watched the room with the patience of someone who understood that truth had its own schedule. Claire approached again, this time with visible concern. People are starting to recognize you, she said softly. Naomi nodded. I expected that. Should we prepare for the announcement? Claire asked. Naomi looked toward the stage where the giant display screens continued cycling through promotional images of the proposed partnership. Soon, she replied. Before Claire could answer, another voice entered the conversation. Ms. Brooks. Naomi turned. Standing before her was Daniel Harper. The analyst looked almost uncertain. I thought it was you, he said. Naomi offered a polite smile. Good evening, Daniel. His eyes widened. The confirmation was all he needed. I cannot believe they do not know who you are. Naomi glanced toward the Whitmore family. Ethan was laughing again. Richard was shaking hands. Victoria was smiling for photographs. Sometimes, Naomi said calmly, People become so focused on appearances that they stop seeing what is actually in front of them. Daniel followed her gaze and slowly nodded. Around them, more eyes turned toward Naomi. More whispers spread through the ballroom. The first witness had recognized the truth. Others were beginning to follow. And for the first time that evening, the foundation beneath the Whitmore family's confidence had started to crack. By 8:36, the ballroom no longer felt quite as comfortable as it had earlier in the evening. The laughter had become less frequent. The conversations sounded more cautious. Even the music seemed distant beneath the growing tension moving through the crowd. Naomi Brooks remained calm, but the room around her was changing. More guests had recognized her. More executives were quietly exchanging looks. The secret was beginning to surface whether anyone intended it to or not. Unfortunately for the Whitmore family, they were still too focused on protecting their pride to notice the warning signs. Ethan spotted Naomi speaking with Daniel Harper and immediately frowned. The attention she was receiving bothered him. He could not explain why. He simply disliked seeing people treat her with respect after what he considered an insignificant incident. He crossed the ballroom and approached with two friends trailing behind him. "There she is," Ethan announced loudly. Several nearby conversations stopped. "Still hanging around?" Daniel's expression tightened. Naomi simply looked at him. "Good evening, Ethan." The calmness in her voice seemed to irritate him even more. "You know," he said, glancing toward the stained dress. Most people would have taken the hint by now. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Nobody laughed. Ethan noticed. He pressed forward anyway. "This section is mostly reserved for partners and decision-makers." The words landed heavily in the air. Naomi remained silent. Daniel looked ready to respond, but Naomi gave him a subtle glance. "Not yet." Ethan mistook the silence for weakness. "Maybe someone should help you find the guest area." One of his friends chuckled nervously. The sound died almost immediately. Across the room, Richard Whitmore noticed the gathering and began walking toward them. Victoria followed close behind. Within moments, the entire family stood together facing Naomi. Richard offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "Just trying to help." Victoria looked Naomi up and down. "This is becoming awkward for everyone." The comment drew quiet reactions from nearby guests. What had once looked like confidence was beginning to resemble arrogance. Richard lowered his voice. "Perhaps it would be best if you enjoyed the remainder of the evening elsewhere." There it was. The message hidden beneath the polished language. "Leave." Naomi looked at him for several seconds. The ballroom seemed to slow around them. Crystal glasses reflected light across the room. Reporters continued setting up equipment near the stage. Somewhere behind the crowd, another group of Horizon executives had just arrived. Yet for a brief moment, Naomi heard only Richard's words. And unexpectedly, they reminded her of another room many years earlier. She was 19, a scholarship student attending a leadership reception in Atlanta. She remembered standing alone near a conference table while executives greeted one another. She remembered a woman assuming she worked event staff because she was black and dressed modestly. She remembered being told that certain conversations were not intended for people like her. The memory returned with perfect clarity. The embarrassment, the disappointment, the realization that some people judged worth before learning a single fact. But she also remembered something else. She remembered promising herself that success would never change her dignity. Back in the ballroom, Naomi's expression remained composed. The past no longer hurt. It informed. It taught. It revealed patterns. And tonight, she was watching those same patterns unfold again in front of hundreds of witnesses. Richard folded his arms. "I think we understand each other." Naomi met his gaze. "I think we do." Neither he nor his family realized that the moment they believed they had pushed her aside was the exact moment they stepped beyond the point of no return. By 8:42, the distance between confidence and catastrophe had narrowed to a matter of minutes. Richard Whitmore returned to his conversations believing the situation had been handled. Victoria resumed greeting donors. Ethan drifted back toward his friends with the relaxed swagger of someone convinced he had won an argument that never truly existed. Around them, however, the ballroom was changing faster than they realized. The whispers had become conversations. The conversations had become questions. And the questions all seemed to lead toward the same woman standing quietly near the marble column. Naomi Brooks glanced once more toward the stage. The massive display screens continued rotating through images of proposed developments, projected revenue figures, and architectural renderings tied to the upcoming partnership. To most guests, it looked like a celebration waiting to happen. To Naomi, it looked like a decision waiting to be finalized. She reached into her evening clutch and removed her phone. No dramatic expression crossed her face. No visible anger lingered from the humiliation she had endured. She simply opened a message thread and typed a single word. Proceed. The message traveled instantly. Hundreds of blocks away, in a glass office overlooking the Hudson River, Naomi's executive assistant Jordan Price received it. Jordan had been waiting all evening. The response came within seconds. Understood. Protocol initiated. Naomi locked her phone and slipped it away. That was all. No speeches. No threats. No warnings. Yet invisible gears had already begun turning. Legal teams received notifications. Board members received updates. Internal review files were unlocked. Meeting records were distributed. The final evaluation process surrounding the Whitmore partnership officially moved into its last stage. Back inside the ballroom, nobody noticed. A string quartet transitioned into another piece. Cameras near the stage were adjusted. Event staff prepared for the scheduled presentation. The contrast was almost surreal. While the evening appeared elegant and orderly on the surface, an entirely different story was unfolding beneath it. Claire Mitchell approached once again. "Everything is ready?" she asked quietly. Naomi nodded. "Everything has always been ready." Claire glanced toward the Whitmore family. Richard was laughing with investors. Victoria was posing for photographs. Ethan was describing his future plans to a group of young entrepreneurs who seemed eager to impress him. "They still do not know," Claire said. Naomi followed her gaze. "No, they do not." A faint smile appeared for the first time all evening. Not a smile of revenge. A smile of certainty. Across the ballroom, Daniel Harper checked his phone and suddenly straightened. He had just received an internal Horizon notification confirming that senior leadership was entering final review. His eyes moved immediately toward Naomi. He understood exactly what it meant. Other executives began checking their devices as well. One by one, subtle reactions appeared throughout the room. Raised eyebrows, quiet exchanges, curious glances. The atmosphere tightened. Richard Whitmore noticed some of it, but misunderstood entirely. "Looks like everyone is excited," he said proudly to an investor. The investor forced a smile, but said nothing. For the first time all evening, Richard's confidence was no longer being reflected back at him. Meanwhile, Naomi stood calmly as the countdown continued. She had learned long ago that real power rarely announced itself. It did not need to. Real power moved through systems, decisions, and consequences. It worked quietly until the moment it became impossible to ignore. And somewhere behind the stage curtains, event organizers were already preparing for the announcement that would change everything before the night was over. At exactly 8:49, the lights above the ballroom softened and the conversations gradually faded. A gentle chime echoed through the room as attention shifted toward the stage. Event staff moved into position. Cameras turned. Reporters straightened their notes. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Richard Whitmore adjusted his jacket and smiled confidently. Victoria reached for a champagne glass. Ethan leaned back with the relaxed expression of someone expecting a victory lap. Around them, investors and executives took their seats. The massive display screens behind the stage illuminated with the logo of the proposed partnership. Applause began to spread through the ballroom. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this historic occasion." More applause followed. Tonight represents months of planning, negotiation, and collaboration. Before we proceed with the formal announcement, we would like to recognize the individual whose leadership, vision, and final approval have made this partnership possible. Richard smiled wider. Victoria exchanged an excited glance with Ethan. Neither noticed the growing tension among several executives seated nearby. The master of ceremonies continued. "This leader transformed a regional company into one of the most respected infrastructure organizations in America. Her projects have reshaped communities from coast to coast. Her commitment to excellence has earned the trust of investors, governments, and business leaders nationwide." The room grew quieter. Several heads slowly turned. The master of ceremonies looked toward the back of the ballroom. Please join me in welcoming the Chief Executive Officer of Horizon Infrastructure, Ms. Naomi Brooks. Silence struck the room before the applause could begin. It lasted only a second, but it felt much longer. A spotlight swept across the ballroom and settled directly on Naomi. Hundreds of eyes followed it. Richard Whitmore froze. Victoria's smile disappeared instantly. Ethan's face drained of color. The woman standing beneath the spotlight was the same woman he had humiliated less than an hour earlier. The same woman wearing the wine-stained dress. The same woman he had repeatedly mocked in front of guests. Naomi calmly stepped forward. Every movement seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Daniel Harper stood first. Then several Horizon executives rose to their feet. One by one, investors and business leaders followed. Applause erupted across the ballroom. Powerful, sustained, unavoidable. Naomi walked toward the stage while the Whitmore family remained motionless. Richard looked as though he was trying to solve an impossible equation. Victoria stared in disbelief. Ethan could not take his eyes off the stage. Naomi reached the podium and waited for the applause to settle. The room obeyed almost immediately. She looked across the audience. Her expression remained composed, professional, unshaken. "Good evening," she began. Her voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "Tonight has been very informative." A nervous ripple moved through the crowd. Naomi allowed a brief pause. Then she continued. "Business partnerships are built on more than projections, contracts, and financial forecasts. They are built on judgment, character, respect." No one moved. No one spoke. "Earlier this evening," Naomi said, "I had the opportunity to observe how people are treated when others believe they have nothing to offer." The words landed with extraordinary precision. Richard lowered his eyes. Victoria looked toward the floor. Ethan appeared unable to breathe. Naomi's gaze settled briefly on the Whitmore family before returning to the audience. "You learn a great deal about people when they think power belongs exclusively to them." The ballroom remained completely silent. And for the first time all night, the Whitmore family understood exactly who had been evaluating whom. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause. Naomi Brooks stood at the podium while hundreds of guests waited for what came next. Behind her, the massive display screens still showed images of the proposed partnership. Towers, transit hubs, expansion plans, $650 million of opportunity hanging in the air above the ballroom. Richard Whitmore remained frozen in his seat. Victoria looked as though she had forgotten how to smile. Ethan stared at the stage, replaying every word he had spoken that evening. Every laugh, every assumption, every moment he had believed there would be no consequences. Naomi glanced briefly toward the front row where several Horizon board members sat. A subtle nod passed between them. The final review had already been completed. The decision had already been made. She returned her attention to the audience. "For months," she said calmly, "our team has evaluated this partnership from every possible angle. Financial strength, operational capacity, long-term vision, community impact." The room listened carefully. "Those factors matter. They always matter. But leadership matters too." Her voice remained steady, controlled, because eventually every contract becomes a reflection of the people behind it. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Naomi pressed a small remote resting beside the podium. The display screens behind her changed. The promotional renderings disappeared. In their place appeared a simple message from Horizon Infrastructure. "Final review status." Several guests immediately sat forward. Richard's face tightened. He knew enough about corporate language to understand what he was seeing. Naomi continued. "This evening provided information that could never be found in spreadsheets, forecasts, or presentations." The screen updated again. "Partnership recommendation declined." A collective gasp moved through the ballroom. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The impact was immediate. Richard Whitmore's shoulders dropped. Victoria's hand slowly lowered from her champagne glass. Ethan looked as though the floor beneath him had vanished. Investors exchanged stunned glances. Reporters began typing furiously. Phones appeared across the room as guests processed what they were witnessing. Naomi remained composed. "After careful review," she said, "Horizon Infrastructure will not be moving forward with the proposed partnership." The words landed with quiet finality. No anger, no dramatic flourish, just a decision. Richard finally stood. "Ms. Brooks," he began, his voice strained. Surely we can discuss this privately. Naomi met his gaze. The opportunity to demonstrate your company's values existed long before this stage. Richard had no answer. Victoria looked towards several investors who suddenly seemed interested in avoiding eye contact. Ethan stared at the wine stain still visible on Naomi's dress. For the first time all evening, he understood what it represented. Not embarrassment. Evidence. Around the ballroom, conversations erupted in hushed waves. Some guests looked shocked. Others looked unsurprised. Many simply nodded. They had witnessed everything. The comments. The assumptions. The treatment Naomi received before anyone knew her title. The outcome now seemed less like punishment and more like consequence. Naomi stepped away from the podium. The applause began slowly. One executive stood, then another. Soon much of the ballroom was on its feet. The sound filled the room. Not because a deal had been canceled, because a standard had been upheld. And as the Whitmore family stood surrounded by the collapse of the future they had already celebrated, they finally realized the most expensive mistake of the evening had never been financial. It had been personal. The applause gradually faded, but the lesson remained suspended in the air long after the sound disappeared. Naomi Brooks stepped away from the podium and descended the stage with the same quiet confidence she had carried from the moment she entered the ballroom. Nothing about her posture had changed. Not when the wine stained her dress. Not when the laughter followed. Not when she was treated as though she did not belong. And certainly not now. Around the room, conversations continued in low voices. Investors reviewed messages on their phones. Reporters hurried to file updates. Executives exchanged observations about what they had just witnessed. Yet the center of attention was no longer the canceled partnership. It was the reason behind it. Richard Whitmore remained standing near his table. The certainty that had carried him through the evening was gone. Victoria looked toward the stage one final time before lowering her eyes. Ethan stood motionless. For perhaps the first time in his life, there was no joke to tell, no audience willing to laugh, and no easy way to escape the consequences of his behavior. As Naomi crossed the ballroom floor, Ethan finally stepped forward. Several guests watched carefully. The room grew quieter again. "Ms. Brooks," he said. His voice sounded different now. Smaller. Less certain. Naomi stopped and turned toward him. Ethan swallowed hard. "I was wrong." The words arrived slowly. What happened tonight should not have happened. Naomi listened without interrupting. Ethan glanced briefly at the stain on her dress. "I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you." Naomi held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once. Not in approval. Not in forgiveness. Simply acknowledgement. Richard approached next. "I would like the opportunity to repair this," he said. "Our company can do better." Naomi considered his words carefully. "Perhaps it can," she replied. "But character is not demonstrated after consequences arrive. Character is demonstrated when nobody believes consequences exist." Richard lowered his head. He understood. The answer was final. Nearby, Claire Mitchell watched quietly. Daniel Harper watched as well. So did dozens of other guests who had witnessed the entire evening unfold from beginning to end. Each person would leave with their own interpretation of the events. Yet one truth connected them all. They had seen how quickly perception could become prejudice. They had seen how easily respect could be withheld based on appearances. And they had seen what happened when those assumptions collided with reality. Naomi continued toward the ballroom exit. The Manhattan skyline still glowed beyond the towering windows. The city looked exactly as it had hours earlier. But inside the Grand Regent Ballroom, something had changed. Not a contract, not a financial projection, a standard. Just before reaching the doors, Naomi paused and looked back one final time. Hundreds of eyes met hers. The room fell silent. Her voice was calm, steady, unforgettable. The wine was never the reason this partnership ended. She allowed the words to settle. What ended it was the belief that dignity belongs only to certain people. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Naomi offered a small, composed smile. "I did not raise my voice tonight," she said. "I raised the standard." Then she turned and walked through the doors. The ballroom remained silent for several seconds after she disappeared from view, because everyone understood they had witnessed something far bigger than a business decision. They had witnessed the moment respect became the most valuable asset in the room.